Hello and welcome to Napta History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold one soft story at a time. Tonight, we'll gently wander through the lives of some of the most overlooked figures in Japanese feudal history, the short samurai who struggled against not just enemies on the battlefield, but the rigid expectations of a society that valued physical stature as much as spiritual strength. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we begin this journey back to ancient Japan, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this. Let's take a moment to set the stage. The feudal period in Japan, lasting from roughly the 12th to the 19th centuries, was dominated by the samurai class, a warrior elite bound by the code of Bushido that emphasized honor, loyalty, and martial prowess. In this rigidly hierarchical society, physical appearance carried enormous weight, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the expectation that a true samurai should possess an imposing physical presence. The ideal warrior was tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding, someone whose very silhouette could strike fear into enemies and inspire confidence in allies. But what happened to those born into samurai families who didn't fit this mold? What challenges faced the men who possessed the heart of a warrior but stood several inches shorter than their peers? Tonight, we'll explore the often heartbreaking, sometimes inspiring stories of samurai who had to prove themselves not just as warriors, but as men worthy of respect in a society that sometimes seemed designed to diminish them. Our journey begins in the early Kamakura period, around 1190, with the story of Minamoto no Chikatada, a young samurai born into a prestigious military family during the rise of the first shogunate. The Minamoto clan had just achieved dominance over their rivals, the Taira, and warrior culture was becoming the defining force in Japanese society. Into this world of horses, armor, and battlefield glory was born Chikatada, the third son of a respected commander who had fought alongside Minamoto no Yoritomo himself. From the moment Chikatada could walk, it was clear that he would face challenges his older brothers would never know. While they grew tall and strong like their father, Chikatada remained diminutive, eventually reaching only 4 feet and 8 inches in height, significantly shorter than the average man of his time, and positively tiny compared to the imposing warriors who filled his father's household. In a culture where physical presence was intimately connected to authority and respect, this would prove to be a burden that shaped every aspect of his life. The first signs of trouble came during his childhood training. Like all samurai sons, Chikatada began learning the martial arts at an early age, starting with basic exercises in balance, coordination, and weapon handling. His instructors, grizzled veterans of the Genpei War, had trained dozens of young warriors and knew immediately that this student would require special attention. The standard-sized wooden practice swords were too long and heavy for his small frame, forcing weapons masters to craft custom training equipment that wouldn't overwhelm his developing muscles. More challenging than the physical adjustments, however, were the psychological ones. During group training sessions with other young samurai from neighboring families, Chikatada found himself constantly overlooked, spoken over, and treated as something of a curiosity. When the boys would form up in ranks to practice formations, he would disappear among his taller peers, his commands lost in the deeper voices of his companions. The other children, not yet versed in the subtle cruelties of adult society, would sometimes openly marvel at his size, asking if he was truly old enough to be training with them. These early humiliations might have broken a lesser spirit, but Chikatada possessed something that his size couldn't diminish, and a burning determination to prove himself worthy of his family name. He began rising before dawn to practice alone, working on his swordwork in the courtyard while the household still slept. He studied strategy texts by candlelight, memorizing the classics of military thought until he could recite entire passages from memory. Most importantly, he began to develop a fighting style that took advantage of his smaller stature rather than trying to overcome it. Traditional samurai combat of the period relied heavily on mounted warfare, with warriors charging at each other on horseback, attempting to knock their opponents to the ground or pierce them with long spears. For Chikatada, this presented obvious challenges. Not only was he easily unseated by larger opponents, but finding a horse that matched his proportions proved nearly impossible. The massive war horses preferred by samurai literally dwarfed him, making mounting and dismounting difficult and leaving him feeling like a child playing at war. However, Chikatada's instructors began to notice that in ground combat, particularly in close quarters, his size could actually be an advantage. He could move more quickly than larger opponents, slip under their guard, and strike at angles they couldn't easily defend against. His lower center of gravity made him harder to knock down, and his smaller target profile meant that many attacks that would devastate a taller warrior would pass harmlessly over his head. Recognizing these strengths, Chikatada's father made the difficult decision to abandon the traditional mounted combat training that defined samurai warfare and instead focus on developing his son as a specialist in foot combat. This was a controversial choice that raised eyebrows among their peers, as fighting on foot was often seen as the province of lower-class Ashigaru soldiers rather than true samurai. But as Chikatada's skills developed, it became clear that this unconventional approach was producing remarkable results. By his 16th birthday, Chikatada had developed into a formidable warrior in his own specialized niche. He had mastered the use of shorter weapons, tanto daggers, wakizashi short swords, and specially crafted katana that were proportioned to his frame. His speed and agility were legendary among those who had witnessed his training, and his strategic mind had impressed even the most senior advisors in his father's service. Yet despite these achievements, the fundamental challenge of his stature remained unchanged. The real test came in 1221, during the Jokyu War, when the retired Emperor Go-Toba attempted to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate. Chikatada, now 31 years old and a veteran of numerous minor conflicts, was selected to join his clan's forces in defending the Hojo Regency. This would be his first major campaign, and he knew that his performance would determine not just his own future, but how his family would be remembered for generations to come. The march to the capital was a trial in itself. While other samurai rode proudly at the head of their units, Chikatada found himself assigned to support roles, managing supply lines, coordinating communications between units, and handling the countless administrative details that kept an army functioning. These were important tasks, but they lacked the glory and recognition that came with battlefield leadership. He watched as younger, taller samurai were given command positions that his experience and skill should have earned him, their height and presence overriding considerations of actual ability. The frustration was compounded by the practical difficulties of campaign life. Standard military equipment was designed for average-sized men, meaning that Chikatada's armor had to be custom-fitted at considerable expense. His tent required special stakes and guy lines to accommodate his shorter reach, and even simple tasks like caring for his horse became complicated by the size differential. Other warriors, focused on their own preparations for battle, rarely had time or inclination to assist with these adjustments, leaving Chikatada to solve these problems alone, while his peers rested or socialized. But it was during the actual fighting that the true cost of his stature became apparent. The battles of the Jokyu War were typical of the period, chaotic melees involving hundreds of mounted warriors charging across open fields, trying to unhorse opponents or pierce them with naginata spears. In this environment, visibility was everything. A warrior needed to be seen by his allies to receive support, by his enemies to issue challenges, and by commanders to receive orders and recognition for his deeds. Chikatada found himself repeatedly lost in the swirl of combat, his shorter stature making him nearly invisible among the forest of horses and riders that surrounded him. When he did manage to engage an enemy, his lack of reach put him at a severe disadvantage. Larger opponents could strike at him while remaining safely beyond the range of his shorter weapons. Even when he successfully defeated an opponent through speed and skill, the victory was often attributed to nearby larger warriors who were more visible to observers. The battle that would define his reputation took place on the outskirts of Kyoto, where a force of imperial loyalists had taken position on a hillside overlooking the Tokaido Road. Chikatada's unit was ordered to assault the position, a dangerous task that would require warriors to charge uphill against entrenched defenders. As the attack began, He found himself struggling to keep pace with the mounted samurai around him, his smaller horse unable to match the powerful strides of the warhorses around him. Halfway up the slope, disaster struck. An arrow fired from the defensive positions struck Chikatada's horse in the neck, sending the animal tumbling to the ground and trapping him beneath its weight. For a terrifying moment, he lay pinned and helpless as the battle raged around him, enemy arrows whistling overhead and the hooves of friendly cavalry thundering past mere inches from his head. Lesser men might have surrendered to panic, but Chikatada's years of training had prepared him for exactly this situation. Working quickly and methodically, he freed himself from the dying horse and assessed his situation. The main assault had swept past him, leaving him alone and on foot in the middle of the battlefield. His options were limited. He could retreat back down the hill to safety, which would mark him as a coward, or he could continue the assault alone, which seemed like suicide. But as he studied the terrain around him, Chikatada spotted an opportunity that the mounted warriors had missed. The Imperial defenders had positioned themselves to repel a mounted assault up the main slope, but their attention was focused on the dramatic charge of the main force. Off to the side, a narrow ravine cut through the hillside, too steep and narrow for horses, but perfectly suited for a single warrior on foot. If he could make his way up this hidden approach, he might be able to attack the defenders from their unprotected flank. The climb was treacherous and exhausting. The ravine was choked with thorny underbrush that tore at his armor and clothing, and the rocky walls were slick with moisture that made every handhold uncertain. Several times loose stones gave way beneath his feet, sending him sliding back down and forcing him to begin the ascent again. But his smaller size, which had been such a disadvantage in mounted combat, now became a crucial asset. He could squeeze through gaps that would have stopped a larger man, and his lighter weight meant that handholds and footholds that couldn't support a full-sized warrior were sufficient for his needs. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Chikatada emerged from the ravine directly behind the Imperial defensive line. The defenders, focused entirely on the frontal assault that was slowly grinding up the main slope, had no idea that an enemy warrior was now among them. For a moment he paused to catch his breath and plan his attack. He was badly outnumbered. At least 15 Imperial warriors stood between him and the command position, where their leader was directing the defense. But Chikatada had one crucial advantage beyond surprise. His years of training in close-quarters combat had prepared him for exactly this type of fighting. In the confined space of the defensive position, with limited room to maneuver, his opponent's longer weapons and larger size actually worked against them. They couldn't bring their naginata spears to bear effectively, and their movements were constrained by the need to avoid striking their own allies. The attack began with Chikatada's Tanto dagger, finding the gap in an unsuspecting defender's armor, dropping the man silently before his comrades realized the danger. By the time the alarm was raised, 2 more warriors had fallen to his swift, precise strikes. The remaining defenders turned to face this unexpected threat, but they found themselves fighting an opponent unlike any they had encountered before. Chikatada moved through their ranks like water flowing around stones, too low and fast for their desperate cuts to find him. His shorter reach, usually such a disadvantage, allowed him to get inside their guard, where their longer weapons became liabilities. One by one, the defenders fell to his blade, their confusion and panic growing as they realized they were being systematically destroyed by a single, undersized opponent. The battle reached its climax when Chikatada faced the Imperial commander, a veteran warrior whose size and skill had made him legendary throughout the capital. The man towered over his diminutive opponent, his massive Nadachi sword gleaming in the afternoon sun as he prepared to end this strange duel with a single, devastating blow. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause as warriors from both sides turned to witness this David and Goliath confrontation. The commander's first attack came with the force of a thunderbolt, a sweeping horizontal cut that would have bisected any normal opponent. But Chikatada wasn't there when the blade arrived. He had dropped to one knee at the last second, allowing the massive sword to pass harmlessly over his head, while he drove his own katana upward into the gap between his opponent's chest and armor. The commander staggered backward, blood streaming from the wound, but his size and strength kept him on his feet. What followed was a deadly dance that showcased everything Chikatada had learned, about turning his disadvantages into strengths. The commander's superior reach meant that he could attack from a distance, but his massive weapon was slow and predictable. Each time the Nodachi swept toward him, Chikatada would shift just enough to avoid the cut, while moving closer to his opponent. The commander's greater strength meant that each of his attacks carried devastating power, but it also meant that when those attacks missed, he was left momentarily off balance and vulnerable. The end came suddenly. The commander, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow on his elusive opponent, overcommitted to a downward strike that drove, perhaps most painfully, the victory did little to change how he was perceived by his peers. Despite having proven his worth in the most dramatic possible way, he continued to be excluded from the informal networks of influence and camaraderie that defined samurai society. Other warriors would gather to share stories of their exploits, but Chikatada often found himself standing at the edges of these conversations, his contributions acknowledged with polite nods before the discussion moved on to more conventional tales of mounted combat and traditional heroics. The years following the Jokyu War brought new challenges as Chikatada struggled to build upon his battlefield success. He served with distinction in several minor conflicts, developing a reputation as a specialist in siege warfare and urban combat, where his unique skills were most valuable. But these roles, while important, lacked the prestige of open-field command positions that went to more imposing figures. He watched as younger, taller samurai advanced past him in rank and responsibility, their physical presence opening doors that remained closed to him despite his superior experience and proven ability. The social isolation was perhaps more difficult than the professional limitations. Marriage prospects were limited for a samurai whose stature might be seen as a weakness to be passed on to future generations. The elaborate social rituals of the samurai class, from tea ceremonies to poetry competitions, were designed around assumptions of physical presence and bearing that worked against him. Even simple acts like entering a room or addressing a gathering became exercises in overcoming the initial impression created by his size. Yet Chikatada persevered, driven by a combination of family pride and personal determination that refused to be diminished by external circumstances. He became known as a thoughtful strategist and a reliable commander, the sort of samurai who might not inspire awe at first glance, but who could be counted on to get difficult jobs done with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. His counsel was sought by senior commanders who valued substance over style, and his training methods were quietly adopted by other warriors who recognized their effectiveness. As he aged, Chikatada began to take on students of his own, often young samurai who faced challenges similar to his own. He developed teaching methods that emphasized adaptability, creativity, and the importance of playing to one's strengths rather than trying to conform to conventional expectations. His dojo became known as a place where unconventional warriors could develop their skills without the judgment and prejudice they might face elsewhere. The final chapter of Chikatada's life came during the early years of the Mongol invasions, when his expertise in defensive warfare made him an invaluable asset to the Japanese resistance. Though he was by then well into his 60s, his strategic mind remained sharp, and his understanding of how to turn disadvantages into advantages proved crucial in developing tactics to counter the Mongol fighting style. He died peacefully in 1281, just months before the divine wind that scattered the second Mongol invasion fleet. Chikatada's legacy is a complex one that speaks to both the possibilities and limitations of individual achievement in a rigid social system. On one hand, his story demonstrates that exceptional skill and determination could overcome even significant disadvantages, allowing a warrior to achieve recognition and respect despite not fitting conventional expectations. On the other hand, it reveals the persistent power of social prejudices and the ways in which even remarkable achievements could be diminished or forgotten when they challenged established norms. His descendants would remember him as a patriarch who taught them that true strength came from within, not from physical stature or social position. But in the broader historical record, his contributions were gradually overshadowed by more conventional heroes, whose stories better fit the mythic ideals of samurai culture. It would take centuries for scholars to fully appreciate the tactical innovations he developed, and the courage he showed in forging his own path through a world that seemed designed to exclude him. As we move forward in time to the late Kamakura period, we encounter another short samurai, whose story reveals different aspects of the challenges faced by those who didn't fit the warrior ideal. Hojo Tokumune's reign as Shiken, or regent, had stabilized the political situation, but it had also crystallized many of the social hierarchies that made life difficult for non-conforming samurai. Into this world was born Ashikaga Yoshisada, a warrior whose diminutive stature would force him to navigate not just battlefield challenges, but the increasingly complex world of court politics and clan rivalries. Yoshisada was born in 1295 to a branch family of the Ashikaga clan, a lineage that would later produce shoguns, but at that time occupied a middle position in the samurai hierarchy. The Ashikaga were respected but not dominant, prosperous but not wealthy, influential but not commanding. This middling status would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for young Yoshisada, providing him with opportunities that would have been denied to a peasant, while still leaving him vulnerable to the prejudices and limitations that affected all short samurai. From his earliest years, it was clear that Yoshisada would face challenges that his cousins and siblings would not. At barely 5 feet tall, and possessed of a slight build that made him appear even smaller, he stood out in a family known for producing tall, imposing warriors. His father, a veteran of the later stages of the Mongol invasions, had earned respect through conventional military service and struggled to understand how to prepare his unconventional son for success in a conventional world. The Ashikaga family's position meant that Yoshisada was educated, not just in martial arts, but in the broader skills required of a samurai administrator: reading, writing, mathematics, and the intricate protocols of court behavior. This education, while valuable, also highlighted the ways in which his physical appearance worked against him in social situations. During formal ceremonies and diplomatic meetings, he found himself literally overlooked, his contributions ignored or attributed to more visible colleagues. The challenge was compounded by changes in samurai culture that had occurred since Chikatada's time, where the earlier Kamakura period had still retained some flexibility and opportunities for unconventional warriors to prove themselves. The late 13th and early 14th centuries saw the hardening of military hierarchies and the increasing importance of hereditary position over individual merit. A short samurai in this era faced not just the practical difficulties of combat, but a social system that was becoming less tolerant of deviation from established norms. Yoshisada's first real test came during his Genpuku coming-of-age ceremony at age 15. This ritual, marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, was particularly important for samurai families, as it formally recognized a young man's readiness to take on adult responsibilities and potentially serve as a warrior. The ceremony involved receiving adult names, weapons, and armor, along with the formal recognition of one's place in the family and clan hierarchy. For most young samurai, the Genpuku was a joyous occasion that marked their entry into the brotherhood of warriors. For Yoshisada, it became an uncomfortable reminder of his differences. The formal armor presented to him had to be specially altered to fit his small frame, a process that drew unwanted attention and whispered comments from attendees. When he performed the ritual sword movements that demonstrated his readiness for combat, the weapons looked oversized in his hands despite being custom-made for his proportions. More challenging than the physical adjustments were the social expectations that accompanied his new status. As an adult samurai, Yoshisada was expected to participate in the competitive displays of martial skill that were central to warrior culture. These contests, whether formal tournaments or informal challenges, were designed to showcase the physical prowess and martial ability that defined samurai identity. For a warrior whose strengths lay in areas that weren't easily demonstrated in such settings, these events became exercises in humiliation rather than honor. The horse archery competitions that were particularly popular during this period proved especially problematic. Yoshisada's smaller stature meant that he couldn't draw the powerful bows used by his peers, and his difficulty in controlling the large war horses made accurate shooting nearly impossible. When he attempted to participate using modified equipment better suited to his size, he was often mocked for his child's toys and excluded from serious competition. Ground combat tournaments offered somewhat better prospects, as his speed and agility could partially compensate for his lack of reach and power, but even here, the formal rules of engagement often worked against him. Traditional dueling protocols emphasized pageantry and display as much as actual fighting skill, with warriors expected to issue challenges, recite their lineages, and engage in elaborate verbal exchanges before combat began. Yoshisada's high, relatively soft voice and unimposing presence meant that these preliminary rituals often devolved into comedy rather than drama, undermining his credibility before the actual fighting even began. The psychological toll of these repeated humiliations was severe. Unlike Chikutada, who had found ways to turn his disadvantages into tactical advantages, Yoshisada struggled to identify areas where his unique characteristics provided genuine benefits. The military technology and tactics of the late Kamakura period were becoming increasingly standardized, leaving less room for the creative adaptations that had allowed earlier generations of unconventional warriors to succeed. Moreover, the social expectations had evolved in ways that made alternative paths to respect and recognition more difficult to pursue. Where Chikutada had been able to build a reputation through battlefield achievements, Yoshisada lived in a period of relative peace where such opportunities were rare. The skills that might have served him well in wartime, strategic thinking, adaptability, attention to detail, were less valued in a society that increasingly prized ceremonial display and hereditary privilege over practical ability. The turning point in Yoshisada's life came through an unexpected source: his appointment as a deputy administrator in charge of managing tax collection in his family's territories. This was not a prestigious position. It was the sort of detailed administrative work that more prominent samurai delegated to subordinates while they focused on martial pursuits and political maneuvering. But for Yoshisada, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate competence in an area where his physical stature was irrelevant. The task was more complex than it initially appeared. The Ashikaga territories included several farming villages, a small market town, and portions of important trade routes that connected the Kanto region with the capital. Managing the tax collection required not just mathematical skill, but diplomatic ability to negotiate with village headmen, merchant guilds, and rival samurai families who had competing claims on various revenue sources. Yoshisada threw himself into this work with the same intensity that other samurai devoted to martial training. He spent weeks traveling through the territories, learning the details of local agriculture, trade patterns, and social relationships that affected tax collection. His small stature, which had been such a disadvantage in martial contexts, actually proved helpful in these civilian interactions. Farmers and merchants found him less intimidating than typical samurai officials, making them more willing to share information and negotiate honestly. More importantly, Yoshisada discovered that his years of being overlooked and underestimated had taught him valuable skills in observation and analysis. While other samurai administrators relied on formal reports and official channels, he had learned to pay attention to subtle cues and unofficial information that others missed. This allowed him to identify tax evasion schemes, uncover corruption among local officials, and develop more efficient collection methods that increased revenue while reducing the burden on taxpayers. The success of his administrative work gradually began to change how Yoshisada was perceived within his family and clan. While he still couldn't compete in martial contests or command respect through physical presence, he had found a way to make himself indispensable through competence and reliability. Senior family members began consulting him on financial matters and territorial management, recognizing that his unconventional background had given him insights that more traditional samurai lacked. This shift in role brought new challenges, however. Administrative success made Yoshisada valuable to his family, but it also marked him as different from the warrior ideal that still dominated samurai culture. Some of his relatives worried that his focus on civilian matters was somehow diminishing the family's martial reputation. Others suggested that such work was beneath the dignity of a true samurai, regardless of how well he performed it. The tension came to a head during a family council meeting in 1320, when the Ashikaga were debating how to respond to growing instability in the Kamakura government. Different factions within the family advocated for various strategies. Some wanted to support the existing regime, others favored the growing imperial restoration movement, and still others preferred to remain neutral and focus on protecting their own interests. Yoshisada found himself in the unusual position of being asked for his opinion, despite his junior status within the family hierarchy. His years of administrative work had given him detailed knowledge of economic and political conditions throughout their territories, information that was crucial for making strategic decisions. But when he spoke, his recommendations were met with skepticism and resistance from relatives who questioned whether someone who had never proven himself in battle could understand the complexities of military and political strategy. The criticism stung particularly because it highlighted the fundamental contradiction in Yoshisada's position. His family valued his administrative skills and relied on his expertise, but they still didn't fully respect him as a samurai because he hadn't achieved conventional military distinction. No matter how valuable his contributions were, he remained somehow lesser in their eyes because he couldn't fulfill the traditional expectations of warrior culture. This paradox would define the remainder of but it was this seemingly mundane work that proved decisive. When the imperial forces achieved victory and established the Ashikaga shogunate, family historians would note that the clan's success had depended as much on Yoshisada's administrative competence as on any warrior's battlefield prowess. Without his careful planning and execution, their military contributions would have been impossible to sustain. Yet even in victory, the recognition that came to Yoshisada was limited and qualified. He received appointments to important administrative positions in the new government, but these were seen as rewards for service rather than acknowledgements of his worth as a samurai. His name appeared in family records as a loyal retainer and capable administrator, but not as a warrior hero whose deeds would be celebrated in future generations. Yoshisada died in 1348, having lived through the transition from one political order to another, while never quite fitting comfortably into either. His life story illustrates the ways in which social change could create new opportunities for unconventional samurai, while still preserving many of the prejudices and limitations that made their lives difficult. He had found success and respect, but only by accepting a role that was somewhat removed from the martial ideals that continued to define samurai identity. His legacy raises important questions about the nature of honor and achievement in a society that claimed to value merit while still privileging birth and physical characteristics over actual ability. Yoshisada had served his family and country with distinction, but his contributions were always seen as supplementary to the real work of warfare that he was deemed unsuited for. This pattern would repeat itself in the stories of many short samurai who found ways to succeed despite their limitations, but who could never fully escape the shadow of their non-conformity. As we continue our journey through the lives of these overlooked warriors, we move forward to the Muromachi period, when changes in military technology and social organization would create new challenges and opportunities for samurai who didn't fit the traditional mold. The rise of Ashigaru foot soldiers and the increasing importance of firearms would begin to level the playing field in some ways, but the fundamental social prejudices against short warriors would prove remarkably persistent. Our next story takes us to the mid-15th century, during the Onin War that devastated Kyoto and marked the beginning of the Sengoku period of constant warfare. Into this chaotic world was born Ito Masanaga, a samurai whose struggles with his stature would be complicated by the rapidly changing nature of warfare itself. Unlike his predecessors, who had faced relatively stable social expectations, Masanaga would have to navigate a world where traditional rules were breaking down, creating both new opportunities and new dangers for those who stood apart from the norm. The Ito family were minor daimyo in Kyushu, controlling a small but strategically important domain that included several key mountain passes and coastal harbors. They had survived the tumultuous 14th century through careful diplomacy and military competence, avoiding the factional conflicts that had destroyed many of their neighbors. But by the time of Masanaga's birth in 1435, the family was facing new challenges as ambitious rivals sought to expand their territories and powerful allies made increasingly demanding requests for support. Masanaga was born during one of the most violent periods in Japanese history, when the collapse of central authority had led to nearly constant warfare between competing factions. The Onin War was raging in the capital, turning Kyoto into a battlefield and sending refugees streaming across the countryside. In this environment, martial prowess was more important than ever before. but the nature of warfare itself was beginning to change in ways that would have profound implications for samurai of all sizes. The introduction of firearms from Portuguese traders was revolutionizing combat, making traditional armor less effective and reducing the importance of individual martial skill. At the same time, the increasing use of large armies composed primarily of ashigaru foot soldiers was changing the scale and character of battles. These developments might have been expected to benefit shorter samurai like Masanaga, who could handle firearms as effectively as their taller peers, and who might find new opportunities in the more egalitarian atmosphere of mass combat. But the reality proved more complex. While firearms did level the playing field in some ways, they also created new forms of social distinction and hierarchy. The most advanced weapons were expensive and required specialized training, often limiting them to samurai who could afford the equipment and instruction. Moreover, the traditional emphasis on personal combat and individual recognition remained strong, meaning that shorter warriors still faced many of the same social and psychological challenges that had affected their predecessors. Masanaga's early training reflected these changing circumstances. Like previous generations of short samurai, he had to master conventional weapons and tactics, while also developing adaptations that took advantage of his particular characteristics. But unlike his predecessors, he also had to learn to use firearms, understand the new tactics being developed for mass combat, and navigate an increasingly complex political environment where traditional loyalties and alliances were constantly shifting. The challenge was compounded by his family's precarious position. The Ito were too small to remain completely independent, but large enough to be valuable as allies or dangerous as enemies. This meant that Masanaga's actions and reputation could have significant consequences for his entire clan. A conventional samurai might have enhanced his family's standing through notable battlefield achievements or prestigious marriages, but these options were largely closed to someone whose physical appearance worked against him in traditional contexts. Instead, Masanaga focused on developing expertise in areas where his stature was less of a disadvantage. He became particularly skilled in siege warfare, where technical knowledge and careful planning were often more important than individual combat ability. He also studied the new firearms technology extensively, becoming one of the first samurai in his region to master both the tactical and technical aspects of gunpowder weapons. His opportunity to prove himself came during a succession dispute in a neighboring domain when the Ito were asked to provide support for one of the competing claimants. The conflict was typical of the period, a complex web of family rivalries, territorial disputes, and shifting alliances that had drawn in dozens of samurai families and thousands of common soldiers. For the Ito, it represented both an opportunity to gain influence and a risk of being drawn into a larger conflict that could destroy them. Masanaga was assigned to command a small unit of ashigaru, armed with the new Tanegashima firearms that his family had recently acquired. This was both an honor and a subtle insult. Leading troops in combat was a traditional samurai role, but commanding foot soldiers rather than mounted warriors reflected his family's minor status and his own limitations as a conventional warrior. Moreover, the firearms unit was seen as experimental and unreliable, making his assignment somewhat peripheral to the main battle plan. But Masanaga had spent months training with these weapons and had developed imitative tactics for their use. He understood that firearms were most effective when used in coordinated volleys, and he had drilled his men extensively in rapid loading and firing techniques. More importantly, he had studied the terrain where the battle was expected to take place, and had identified positions where his unit could maximize their impact while minimizing their exposure to enemy cavalry charges. The battle itself was a chaotic affair that lasted 2 days and involved thousands of combatants. Traditional mounted samurai charged back and forth across the field, engaging in individual duels and small unit actions, while larger formations of ashigaru clashed with spears and naginata. In this confused environment, Masanaga's firearms unit initially seemed insignificant, their slow rate of fire and limited range making them appear almost irrelevant compared to the dramatic cavalry charges and hand-to-hand combat that dominated the fighting. But as the battle progressed, the value of disciplined firearms began to become apparent. When enemy cavalry attempted to break through the center of the Allied line, Masanaga's unit was positioned to fire into their flank, dropping several horses and riders with carefully aimed volleys. When a group of enemy samurai tried to storm a strategic hill, his men were able to suppress their advance with sustained fire, while allied reinforcements moved into position. Most importantly, Masanaga demonstrated that firearms could be used to neutralize some of the advantages that larger, more imposing warriors had traditionally enjoyed. A tall samurai on horseback was actually a better target for his gunners than a smaller opponent, and the psychological impact of gunfire often proved more devastating than the physical damage it inflicted. Enemy warriors who had never faced firearms before were often paralyzed by the noise and smoke, allowing much smaller forces to achieve effects that would have required far larger numbers using conventional weapons. The decisive moment came when the enemy commander, frustrated by the stalemate, decided to lead a personal charge against the position held by Masanaga's unit. This was exactly the sort of dramatic gesture that defined traditional samurai warfare, a leader placing himself in danger to inspire his followers and demonstrate his courage. But it was also exactly the sort of target that firearms were best suited to engage. Masanaga had positioned his men in a defensive formation that channeled attacking cavalry into a narrow killing zone where multiple guns could be brought to bear on individual targets. When the enemy commander appeared at the head of his charge, Masanaga personally took aim with his own Tanegashima and fired. The shot struck the commander's horse, sending both animal and rider tumbling to the ground in full view of both armies. The psychological impact was enormous. The enemy forces, seeing their leader fallen, began to waver and retreat. The Allied troops, meanwhile, were inspired by this demonstration of the power of the new weapons and pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Within an hour, the battle was over, and Masanaga's small unit had played a crucial role in determining the outcome. But once again, the recognition that followed was complicated by social prejudices and traditional expectations. While military historians would later identify Masanaga's tactics as innovative and effective, contemporary observers were more ambivalent about his achievement. Some praised his tactical skill and the effectiveness of his firearms unit, but others questioned whether this type of fighting was truly appropriate for a samurai. The use of projectile weapons to kill enemies from a distance was seen by many as somehow less honorable than face-to-face combat with traditional weapons. Moreover, the specific nature of his achievement, shooting an enemy commander from a concealed position, struck some critics as verging on assassination rather than honorable combat. The fact that he had used his small stature to remain hidden while taking aim was seen as an advantage gained through deception rather than superior skill or courage. These criticisms were largely unfair, but they reflected the persistent belief that true samurai should fight in ways that emphasized personal valor and physical presence rather than tactical cleverness. The controversy surrounding his battlefield success highlights one of the central paradoxes faced by short samurai throughout the feudal period. When they succeeded through conventional means, their achievements were often dismissed or minimized because they didn't fit expected stereotypes. But when they developed alternative approaches that took advantage of their unique characteristics, they were criticized for departing from traditional ideals. It was a no-win situation that forced them to choose between conformity and effectiveness. Masanaga chose effectiveness, continuing to develop and refine his firearms tactics throughout the remaining conflicts of his career. He became known as one of the foremost experts on gunpowder weapons in Kyushu, and his innovations were adopted by other commanders who recognized their value regardless of their source. But he never fully escaped the stigma of being seen as an unconventional warrior whose methods, while successful, somehow fell short of the samurai ideal. His later years were spent training younger samurai in the use of firearms and serving as a military advisor to his family's allies. These roles allowed him to contribute meaningfully to his clan's success and security, but they also marked him as a specialist rather than a general-purpose warrior. He was respected for his expertise, but not quite accepted as a peer by samurai who had achieved distinction through more traditional means. Masanaga died in 1503, having lived through the transition from medieval to early modern warfare, and having played a significant role in adapting samurai culture to the realities of the new military technology. His story illustrates both the opportunities and limitations that technological change created for unconventional warriors. While firearms provided new ways for skill and intelligence to overcome physical disadvantages, they didn't eliminate the social prejudices that continued to shape how different types of achievement were valued and recognized. His legacy is particularly significant because he helped establish precedents for how samurai could adapt to changing circumstances while still maintaining their identity as warriors. The tactical innovations he developed would be refined and expanded by later generations, ultimately contributing to the military success that allowed Japan to remain independent during the early period of European contact. But the social questions his career raised about what constituted appropriate samurai behavior would continue to be debated long after his death. As we continue our exploration of short samurai throughout Japanese history, we encounter increasingly complex stories that reflect the growing sophistication of military technology and social organization. The challenges faced by these warriors evolved over time, but the fundamental tension between individual merit and social expectations remained a constant thread throughout. Hideaki's challenges began early and were immediately apparent to everyone around him. At barely 4 feet 6 inches tall and possessing a slight build that made him appear even smaller, he stood out dramatically in a family known for producing tall, imposing warriors. The Kobayakawa had built their reputation on conventional military virtues, cavalry charges, siege warfare, and the sort of personal combat that emphasized physical presence and martial skill. Hideaki's appearance suggested that he would struggle to uphold these traditions. The situation was complicated by the particular demands of Sengoku period warfare, which had evolved significantly from the relatively small-scale conflicts of earlier eras. Battles now involved tens of thousands of combatants, complex logistics networks, and sophisticated coordination between different types of units. Commanders were expected to manage not just their own personal combat roles, but vast military organizations that included samurai, a shigeru, support personnel, and increasingly specialized technical units. This evolution in warfare created both opportunities and challenges for shorter samurai. On one hand, the increasing importance of logistics, intelligence, and coordination meant that purely physical considerations were becoming less dominant in determining military success. A commander who could effectively manage complex operations might prove more valuable than one who was merely an impressive individual fighter. On the other hand, the larger scale of operations meant that visibility and presence were more important than ever for maintaining authority and coordinating large forces. Hideaki's education reflected these changing requirements. While he received traditional training in swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship, much of his instruction focused on the broader skills required of a military commander: strategy, logistics, intelligence gathering, and the management of large organizations. His tutors, many of whom were veterans of the major campaigns of the mid-16th century, recognized that his physical limitations might actually be less significant in this new type of warfare than they would have been in earlier periods. The young samurai threw himself into these studies with characteristic intensity, perhaps recognizing that intellectual and organizational skills represented his best opportunity to achieve distinction despite his physical disadvantages. He became particularly interested in the innovations that commanders like Oda Nobunaga had introduced, including the use of large firearms units, the integration of castle sieges with field operations, and the development of supply systems that could support armies far from their home territories. His first real opportunity to demonstrate his abilities came in 1592, when he was assigned to serve as an aide to senior commanders during Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea. This campaign, which aimed to use Korea as a stepping stone for the conquest of China, represented the largest military operation in Japanese history up to that point. It involved over 200,000 troops, hundreds of ships, and supply lines that stretched across the Korea Strait. For a young samurai seeking to prove himself, it offered both tremendous opportunities and enormous risks. Hideaki's role was initially minor. He was responsible for coordinating communications between different units and ensuring that supplies reached forward positions. This was important work, but it lacked the glory and recognition that came with combat commands or diplomatic missions. Moreover, his assignment to logistical duties rather than fighting roles was seen by some as evidence that his superiors didn't consider him suitable for real samurai work. But the Korean campaign proved to be exactly the sort of complex, large-scale operation where organizational skills were at least as important as individual martial prowess. The Japanese forces found themselves fighting in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who used different tactics and equipment. More challenging still, they had to maintain supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory while dealing with Korean guerrillas, Chinese intervention, and the logistical nightmares of supporting such a large force so far from home. In this environment, Hideaki's attention to detail and organizational abilities proved invaluable. While more prominent commanders focused on dramatic battles and territorial conquests, he worked behind the scenes to solve the countless practical problems that determined whether those battles could be fought at all. He developed systems for moving supplies through difficult terrain, established intelligence networks that provided early warning of enemy movements, and created backup plans for situations when primary supply routes were disrupted. His efforts came to the attention of senior commanders during the siege of Pyongyang in 1593, when a breakdown in supply deliveries threatened to force a Japanese withdrawal just as the city was about to fall. The problem was typical of the challenges that plagued the Korean campaign. Multiple units had competing claims on limited transportation resources, local guides had provided misleading information about road conditions, and Korean raiders had disrupted several supply convoys. While other staff officers debated blame and attempted to find quick fixes, Hideaki quietly organized alternative solutions. He negotiated agreements between competing units that allowed resources to be pooled and used more efficiently. He established direct communications with supply bases in Japan that bypassed the unreliable intermediate commanders who had been causing delays. Most importantly, he personally led a dangerous mission to open an alternative supply route through territory that other officers had deemed too risky to use. The mission required Hideaki to travel with a small escort through mountainous terrain that was known to be frequented by Korean irregular forces. His small size, which had so often been a disadvantage in conventional military contexts, proved to be an asset in this type of covert operation. He could move more quietly than larger men, required fewer supplies, and was better able to take advantage of concealment opportunities that wouldn't have hidden a more imposing figure. The journey took 3 days and involved several close encounters with enemy patrols, but Hideaki successfully established contact with Japanese coastal forces and arranged for supplies to be moved inland through a route that had been overlooked by previous planners. When the siege resumed with adequate supplies, the city fell within a week, and Hideaki's contribution was recognized as having been crucial to the success of the operation. But once again, the recognition was qualified and limited. While his superiors acknowledged the importance of his logistical work, they continued to see it as supplementary to the real military achievements of commanders who had led direct assaults or won notable duels. His success was praised as evidence of his value as a staff officer, but not as proof of his potential as an independent commander. The distinction was subtle but important, marking him as someone who could support others' successes, rather than achieve distinction in his own right. This pattern continued throughout the Korean campaign and the subsequent conflicts that marked the end of the Sengoku period. Hideaki consistently proved himself to be an exceptionally competent organizer and problem solver, but he was never given opportunities to demonstrate leadership in more conventional military contexts. His achievements were real and valuable, but they occurred in areas that were seen as peripheral to the core activities that defined samurai identity. The situation reached a crisis point during the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, when Hideaki found himself forced to choose between loyalty to his Kobayakawa relatives, who supported the Western Army, and his own assessment of which side was more likely to prevail. This was exactly the sort of decision that the Sengoku period had made common, moments when personal loyalty, family obligations, and strategic calculation all pointed in different directions. Hideaki's choice to support Tokugawa Ieyasu's Eastern Army was based primarily on his analysis of the military and political factors involved. He had spent years studying the capabilities and weaknesses of the various commanders involved, and his conclusion was that Ieyasu had significant advantages in resources, positioning, and strategic planning. But his decision was also influenced by his awareness that his own prospects for advancement were likely to be better under a new regime that might be more willing to recognize unconventional talents. His role in the battle itself was relatively minor. He commanded a reserve unit that never saw significant action and had little direct impact on the outcome. But his decision to join the winning side at a crucial moment helped ensure his family's survival and positioned him for advancement in the new Tokugawa regime. However, the recognition he received was still limited by the persistent prejudices that had shaped his entire career. In the aftermath of Sekigahara, when Ieyasu was distributing rewards and punishments based on each family's contribution to his victory, Hideaki received a modest increase in his stipend and a ceremonial position in the new administration. These rewards acknowledged his service and loyalty, but they fell far short of the dramatic elevations that were granted to more prominent supporters. Other commanders who had played similar roles but possessed more imposing physical presence received major territorial grants and important administrative positions. The disappointment was compounded by the realization that even under a new regime, the fundamental social dynamics that had limited his advancement remained unchanged. The Tokugawa system, while more centralized and bureaucratic than its predecessors, still placed enormous emphasis on personal presence and traditional warrior virtues. If anything, the new emphasis on ceremony and protocol made physical appearance even more important in determining how individuals were perceived and valued. Hideaki's later years were spent serving in various administrative roles that took advantage of his organizational skills while keeping him somewhat removed from the centers of power and recognition. He helped develop some of the logistical systems that would support the Tokugawa military establishment for the next 2 centuries, and his innovations in supply management and communications were quietly adopted throughout the new bureaucracy. But his contributions remained largely invisible to outside observers, and his name appeared in official records primarily as a competent subordinate, rather than a significant leader. He died in 1632, having lived through the entire transition from the chaos of the Sengoku period to the stability of the early Tokugawa era. His life story illustrates both the possibilities and limitations that major social and political changes created for unconventional samurai, while the new emphasis on administration and organization created opportunities for individuals with his particular talents. The underlying social prejudices that had always affected short warriors proved remarkably persistent. Perhaps most significantly, Hideaki's career demonstrates how the increasing bureaucratization of samurai society could create new forms of marginalization, even as it eliminated some traditional barriers. In earlier periods, exceptional warriors could sometimes overcome social prejudices through dramatic battlefield achievements that forced recognition of their abilities. But in the more structured and hierarchical world of the Tokugawa system, such opportunities became increasingly rare, and advancement depended more heavily on navigating complex social and political networks, where physical presence and traditional credentials carried significant weight. As we move into the early Edo period, we encounter the story of Matsudaira Nobuyoshi, whose experiences reveal how the complete pacification of Japan created entirely new challenges for samurai who didn't fit conventional expectations. Born in 1640, into a minor branch of the Matsudaira family that was distantly related to the Tokugawa, Nobuyoshi grew up in a world where the traditional justification for samurai privilege, their role as warriors, was becoming increasingly theoretical. The Matsudaira were numerous and diverse, ranging from powerful daimyo, who ruled major domains, to minor retainers, who served in humble administrative positions. Nobuyoshi's branch of the family fell somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, possessing enough status to ensure a comfortable living, but not enough influence to guarantee significant opportunities for advancement. This intermediate position would prove to be both a blessing and a curse, as he navigated the complex social landscape of Tokugawa Japan. At barely 5 feet tall, and possessed of a delicate build that made him appear younger than his actual age, Nobuyoshi faced challenges that were in some ways more difficult than those encountered by earlier generations of short samurai. While his predecessors had at least lived in times when individual merit could sometimes overcome social prejudices through battlefield achievement, he came of age in an era when such opportunities were essentially non-existent. The samurai class had been transformed from active warriors into a hereditary bureaucracy, but the social expectations and prejudices that had developed during centuries of warfare remained largely intact. The challenge was compounded by the particular characteristics of Edo period samurai culture, which placed enormous emphasis on ceremony, protocol, and the maintenance of proper appearances. The elaborate rituals that governed everything from court attendance to tea ceremonies were designed around assumptions about physical presence and bearing that worked against anyone who didn't fit conventional expectations. A samurai's credibility and authority were increasingly determined by his ability to navigate these formal contexts successfully, and Nobuyoshi's appearance often undermined his efforts before he could demonstrate his actual abilities. His education reflected the changing requirements of samurai life in the peaceful Edo period. While he still received training in traditional martial arts, swordsmanship, archery, and the other skills that defined warrior identity, much of his instruction focused on the literary and administrative abilities that were becoming more important in actual samurai careers. He studied classical Chinese literature, learned the complex rules of etiquette that governed social interactions, and mastered the bureaucratic procedures that controlled everything from tax collection to judicial proceedings. These academic subjects were areas where Nobuyoshi's physical stature was largely irrelevant, and he excelled in his studies with a dedication that reflected both his natural intelligence and his awareness that intellectual achievement might be his best path to recognition and advancement. His tutors praised his quick understanding and thorough preparation. Most students approach such assignments as exercises in applying established legal principles to specific situations, producing carefully structured arguments that demonstrated their mastery of existing precedents and procedures. But Nobuyoshi's analysis went far beyond this conventional approach, identifying subtle inconsistencies in the applicable laws and suggesting innovative solutions that had apparently not occurred to the officials who were actually handling the case. His work came to the attention of senior administrators when it was discovered that his proposed resolution would not only solve the immediate dispute, but also establish precedents that could be used to handle similar cases in the future. The quality of his analysis was so exceptional that it was forwarded to officials in the central government, where it influenced actual policy decisions and helped shape the development of commercial law throughout the Tokugawa domains. This achievement should have marked Nobuyoshi as an exceptionally promising young administrator, deserving of significant opportunities and rapid advancement, and indeed, his intellectual abilities were now recognized and respected by those who had worked closely with him. But the broader social recognition that should have accompanied such distinction remained elusive, undermined by the persistent prejudices that affected how others perceived and evaluated him. The problem became apparent when he began seeking appointment to positions that would allow him to use his analytical and administrative skills in service to his domain. While his academic credentials were excellent, and his abilities were acknowledged by those who knew him well, the officials responsible for making appointments were often meeting him for the first time and forming their initial impressions based on his physical appearance rather than his demonstrated competence. During formal interviews, Nobuyoshi would find himself having to overcome skepticism and doubt before he could even begin to demonstrate his qualifications. Interview panels would question whether someone who looked so young and slight could command the respect necessary to function effectively in administrative roles that required interaction with senior officials, powerful merchants, and other important figures. Even when his responses demonstrated sophisticated understanding and mature judgment, there often remained a subtle sense that he was somehow not quite right for positions of significant responsibility. The frustration was compounded by his awareness that less qualified candidates were receiving appointments that should have been his based on merit alone. Taller, more imposing samurai with inferior academic records and less impressive analytical abilities were chosen for positions where their physical presence was seen as more important than their actual competence. The system that was supposed to reward merit and service was still heavily influenced by superficial considerations that had little to do with actual ability to perform required duties. This pattern continued throughout the early years of Nobuyoshi's career, as he was consistently assigned to supporting roles that utilized his skills while keeping him somewhat removed from positions of high visibility and authority. He worked on increasingly complex and important projects, often producing analyses and recommendations that shaped major policy decisions, but he rarely received public credit for these contributions. His work was valued and relied upon, but he remained largely invisible to the broader samurai community that determined social status and recognition. The situation reached a crisis point in 1675, when a major corruption scandal erupted in his domain's financial administration. Several senior officials had been systematically embezzling funds intended for infrastructure projects, using their positions to enrich themselves and their allies, while neglecting their responsibilities to maintain roads, bridges, and other essential services. The scandal threatened not only the domain's financial stability, but its reputation with the central government, which was taking an increasingly dim view of administrative incompetence and corruption. Nobuyoshi was assigned to lead the investigation into the scandal, a task that required not only analytical skills, but also the ability to navigate complex political relationships and resistance from powerful interests, who preferred that their activities remain hidden. This was exactly the sort of high-profile, sensitive assignment that could make or break a career, offering opportunities for recognition and advancement, while also carrying significant risks for anyone who handled it poorly. The investigation proved to be even more complex than initially anticipated. The corruption network involved dozens of officials at various levels of the administration, and the financial irregularities stretched back over more than a decade. Unraveling the details required painstaking analysis of thousands of documents, careful interviews with reluctant witnesses, and the reconstruction of financial transactions that had been deliberately obscured by those involved. More challenging than the technical aspects of the investigation were the political obstacles that Nobuyoshi encountered. Many of the officials implicated in the scandal were well-connected members of important families, and they used their influence to obstruct the investigation and discredit its findings. They questioned Nobuyoshi's authority to examine their activities, challenged his competence to understand complex financial matters, and suggested that someone of his apparent youth and inexperience was being manipulated by political rivals who were using the investigation to settle personal scores. These attacks were particularly painful because they exploited exactly the vulnerabilities that had affected Nobuyoshi throughout his career. His physical appearance made it easy for critics to portray him as naive and inexperienced, regardless of his actual qualifications and achievements. The suggestion that he was being used by others played on assumptions about his inability to function as an independent authority figure, while questions about his competence echoed the doubts that had been raised throughout his educational and professional development. But Nobuyoshi had learned over the years how to deal with such challenges, and he responded to the attacks with a combination of meticulous preparation and quiet determination that gradually wore down his opponent's resistance. Rather than trying to assert his authority through dramatic gestures or confrontational tactics, he simply continued his methodical investigation, accumulating evidence and building cases that became increasingly difficult to deny or dismiss. The breakthrough came when he discovered documentary evidence that one of the senior officials involved in the scandal had been systematically falsifying records to cover his tracks. The evidence was so clear and comprehensive that it could not be disputed, and it provided the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Within weeks, Nobuyoshi had mapped out the complete network of corruption and prepared detailed cases against all of the major participants. The results of his investigation led to the largest series of prosecutions in the domain's history, with dozens of officials facing punishment ranging from fines and demotion to exile and ritual suicide. The financial recovery from seized assets and returned funds was substantial enough to fund several major infrastructure projects that had been delayed by the embezzlement. Most importantly, the thoroughness and integrity of the investigation restored confidence in the domain's administration and earned praise from officials in the central government. For Nobuyoshi personally, the success of the investigation should have been a career-defining achievement that established his reputation and opened doors to senior positions throughout the Tokugawa system. His work had demonstrated not only exceptional analytical abilities, but also the political skill and personal integrity required for the most sensitive and important assignments. Yet even in his moment of greatest triumph, the recognition he received was somehow less than what his achievement merited. The official commendations praised his thoroughness and competence, but they described his work in terms that emphasized technical skill rather than leadership ability. He was recognized as an exceptionally capable investigator and analyst, but not quite acknowledged as the kind of authority figure who might be suitable for the highest levels of responsibility. The distinction was subtle but significant, marking him as someone who could be relied upon to execute complex tasks, rather than someone who might be trusted to define policy and direct major initiatives. This qualified recognition reflected the persistent influence of social prejudices that even extraordinary achievement could not completely overcome. While Nobuyoshi had proven his competence beyond any reasonable doubt, he had not been able to change fundamental assumptions about what kind of person was suitable for positions of ultimate authority and responsibility. His success had earned him respect and security, but not the complete acceptance and recognition that should have accompanied such exceptional service. Nobuyoshi spent the remainder of his career in increasingly responsible but still somewhat specialized roles that took advantage of his particular talents, while keeping him at least partially removed from the highest levels of authority and visibility. He became known as one of the most capable administrators in the domain, and his advice was sought on the most complex and sensitive matters, but he never quite achieved the status of a senior leader whose opinions shaped major policy decisions. He died in 1708, having served his domain with exceptional distinction for more than 30 years, and having contributed to important reforms and improvements that enhanced both its prosperity and its reputation. His career had been successful by any reasonable measure, but it had also been limited by social constraints that had little to do with his actual abilities or achievements. His story illustrates how even the most meritocratic aspects of Tokugawa society remained influenced by prejudices and assumptions that could prevent exceptional individuals from achieving their full potential. As we near the end of the Edo period and approach the modern era, we encounter the story of one final short samurai whose experiences reveal how the changing nature of Japanese society created new challenges and opportunities for those who had always struggled to fit conventional expectations. Takeda Shinsaku, born in 1820 during the final decades of the Tokugawa shogunate, came of age in a world where traditional samurai values were increasingly under pressure from foreign contact, internal reform movements, and the growing realization that Japan would need to modernize rapidly to survive in the changing international environment. Shinsaku was born into a minor samurai family in the Choshu domain, which would later play a crucial role in the overthrow of the Tokugawa system and the establishment of the Meiji government. His family had served the Mori clan for generations, occupying middle-ranking positions in the domain's administration and maintaining the modest but respectable lifestyle that characterized the lower levels of the samurai hierarchy. But by the time of his birth, even this traditional existence was becoming increasingly precarious as economic and social pressures strained the foundations of the feudal system. At just under 5 feet tall and possessed of a slight build that made him appear almost frail, Shinsaku faced the familiar challenges that had affected short samurai throughout Japanese history. But he also confronted entirely new circumstances that his predecessors had never had to navigate. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853. His first real opportunity to demonstrate his abilities came during the political upheavals of the 1850s and 1860s, when the Koshu domain became one of the centers of opposition to the Tokugawa government's policies toward foreign powers. The domain's leaders had decided that Japan needed to expel the foreign barbarians and restore the emperor to his rightful position as the country's supreme authority. This was a dangerous stance that put them in direct conflict with the shogunate and risked the destruction of their domain if their rebellion failed. Shinsaku was assigned to help organize the military forces that would be needed to support this ambitious and risky strategy. This was both an honor and a burden. It reflected recognition of his abilities and commitment to the cause, but it also placed him in a position where failure could mean not just personal disgrace, but the destruction of his family and domain. Moreover, the military challenges involved were unlike anything that previous generations had faced, requiring the integration of traditional samurai units with new weapons and tactics derived from Western military science. The task was complicated by the fact that most of the domain's senior military leaders had little understanding of modern warfare and were reluctant to abandon the traditional approaches that had defined their identity and status. They recognized the need for modernization in theory, but they resisted specific changes that seemed to threaten their positions or challenge their expertise. This created a situation where innovation was desperately needed, but politically dangerous for anyone who advocated it too aggressively. Shinsaku approached these challenges with a combination of technical competence and diplomatic skill that reflected his understanding of both military requirements and political realities. Rather than trying to impose Western methods wholesale, he developed hybrid approaches that incorporated new technologies and tactics, while preserving enough traditional elements to maintain the support of conservative leaders. His small stature, which had so often been a disadvantage in conventional contexts, actually proved helpful in these delicate negotiations. He appeared less threatening to traditional authority figures and could advocate for changes without seeming to challenge their status directly. The real test of his approach came during the Choshu Civil War of 1864, when competing factions within the domain fought for control over its policies and leadership. Shinsaku found himself supporting the radical faction that favored complete commitment to anti-foreign policies and preparation for war against the shogunate. This was a dangerous position that could easily result in exile or death if the conservative faction gained control, but it was also the stance that offered the best opportunities for the kind of military innovation that his talents were best suited to support. The conflict was intense but relatively brief, decided as much by political maneuvering and shifting alliances as by actual fighting. When the radical faction emerged victorious, Shinsaku found himself in a position to implement the military reforms that he had been advocating. But he also discovered that success brought new challenges and responsibilities that tested his abilities in ways he had not anticipated. The victorious radicals now faced the task of actually preparing for war against the Tokugawa government, which commanded vastly superior resources and had the support of most other domains. This meant that Choshu would need to achieve dramatic improvements in military effectiveness very quickly, using limited resources and working with personnel who had little experience with modern warfare. It was exactly the sort of impossible task that could destroy reputations and careers, but it was also the kind of challenge where innovative approaches and unconventional thinking might provide decisive advantages. Shinsaku threw himself into this work with characteristic intensity, recognizing that this might be his only opportunity to prove that his ideas about military modernization could produce real results. He organized training programs that combined traditional samurai skills with Western drill and tactics. He worked with blacksmiths and craftsmen to produce weapons that incorporated foreign designs while using available materials and techniques. Most importantly, he developed strategies that took advantage of Choshu's particular circumstances rather than trying to copy Western or traditional approaches wholesale. His efforts culminated in the creation of the Kihaitai, or irregular units, which represented a radical departure from traditional samurai military organization. These units were recruited from all social classes rather than being limited to samurai, and they were armed and trained according to Western principles rather than traditional Japanese methods. The innovation was controversial because it challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and military organization, but it proved remarkably effective in preparing forces that could compete with more conventional enemies. The success of these units during the conflicts that followed demonstrated that Shinsaku's approach to military innovation had been fundamentally sound. When Choshu forces fought against Tokugawa armies and won decisive victories, it became clear that traditional methods were indeed inadequate for the challenges that Japan faced. The recognition that followed these successes finally provided Shinsaku with the acknowledgement and respect that had eluded him throughout his early career. But this triumph was short-lived. The rapid pace of change during the final years of the Tokugawa period meant that even successful innovations quickly became obsolete as new challenges and opportunities emerged. The establishment of the Meiji government in 1868 created an entirely new political and social environment, where traditional samurai privileges were being systematically eliminated and Western-style institutions were being imposed throughout Japanese society. In this new world, Shinsaku's innovations in military organization and training were recognized as having been ahead of their time, but they were also seen as transitional steps toward more complete modernization rather than as permanent solutions to Japan's defense needs. The samurai class itself was being abolished, and the traditional justifications for samurai privilege were being replaced by meritocratic principles that, in theory at least, should have favored individuals like Shinsaku who had demonstrated exceptional ability regardless of their physical characteristics. But the reality proved more complex. While the new Meiji system did create opportunities for talented individuals from all backgrounds to achieve advancement based on merit, it also established new forms of hierarchy and discrimination that could be just as limiting as the traditional prejudices they replaced. Western-educated elites often looked down on those whose knowledge came from Japanese sources, while military leaders who had studied abroad sometimes dismissed the innovations developed by domestic reformers as inadequate or outdated. Shinsaku found himself caught between these competing systems of evaluation. Respected for his historical contributions, but not quite accepted as a full peer by the new Western-educated elite that was taking control of Japanese military and political institutions. His innovations had helped make the Meiji Restoration possible. But the success of that restoration had created new standards and expectations that somewhat diminished the significance of his earlier achievements. He died in 1885, having lived through the complete transformation of Japanese society from feudal isolation to modern nation-state. His life story encapsulates many of the themes that had affected short samurai throughout the feudal period: the struggle to achieve recognition despite physical disadvantages, the development of alternative approaches that took advantage of unique characteristics, and the persistent influence of social prejudices that could limit recognition even when achievement was undeniable. But his story also points toward the broader changes that would ultimately make such struggles less relevant. The modernization of Japanese society gradually shifted emphasis away from physical presence and traditional warrior characteristics toward the technical and intellectual skills that had always been Shinsaku's greatest strengths. While discrimination and prejudice certainly didn't disappear, the criteria for success became more diverse and more closely related to actual performance rather than superficial characteristics. As we reflect on the stories of these remarkable individuals, from Chikatada in the early Kamakura period to Shinsaku in the final days of the samurai era, several important themes emerge. Perhaps most significantly, we see how social prejudices and expectations could persist across centuries of dramatic change, affecting individuals regardless of their actual abilities or achievements. The specific challenges faced by short samurai evolved over time as military technology, political systems, and social organization changed, but the fundamental tension between individual merit and conventional expectations remained remarkably consistent. We also see how exceptional individuals found ways to succeed despite these obstacles, often by developing innovative approaches that turned their apparent disadvantages into actual strengths. Whether it was Chikatada's development of close-quarters combat techniques, Masanaga's mastery of firearms tactics, or Shinsaku's integration of traditional and Western military methods, these warriors demonstrated that creativity, perhaps most importantly, their stories remind us that history is shaped not just by the famous and powerful, but by countless individuals who struggled against limitations and prejudices to make their own contributions to the world around them. The short samurai we've encountered represent just a small fraction of the unconventional warriors who found ways to serve their families, domains, and country, despite not fitting the heroic ideal that dominated their culture. Their experiences offer insights that remain relevant today, as we continue to grapple with questions about merit, opportunity, and the ways in which superficial characteristics can influence how individuals are perceived and valued. While the specific circumstances they faced were products of their historical moment, the broader themes of their struggles speak to universal human experiences of overcoming adversity and finding ways to make meaningful contributions despite the obstacles that society places in our path. In celebrating their achievements and acknowledging their struggles, we honor not just these particular individuals, but all those throughout history who have refused to be limited by others' expectations and who have found ways to leave the world a little better than they found it. Their stories remind us that true strength comes not from conforming to conventional ideals, but from having the courage to forge our own paths and the determination to prove our worth through our actions rather than our appearance. And with that, our journey through the lives of these overlooked warriors draws to a close. I hope you've enjoyed this relaxing and informative excursion into the hidden corners of Japanese history, and that you're now drifting off into peaceful dreams filled with the quiet courage of those who proved that honor and achievement come in all sizes. If you found comfort in learning about these remarkable individuals who overcame such daunting odds, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter of forgotten history waiting to be told. The feudal world may seem remote to us now, but the lessons we can learn from these determined samurai are as relevant as ever. By honoring their legacies and remembering their struggles, we expand our understanding of what it means to face adversity with dignity and determination. So as we close this chapter on some of history's most overlooked warriors, let us carry forward their spirit of resilience and hope, for in their quiet triumphs over prejudice and limitation, they remind us that the human spirit, regardless of the vessel that contains it, has an infinite capacity for greatness when fueled by courage, wisdom, and an unshakable belief in one's own worth. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the extraordinary lives hidden within ordinary circumstances. Until next time, this is your friendly neighborhood history narrator, wishing you sweet dreams of fair samurai, whose true strength lay not in their stature, but in the greatness of their hearts. Good night, and may their examples inspire you to find your own path to honor and achievement, whatever obstacles you may face.